So I want to start by painting the vision for you. And it comes from page 57 of the book Education by Ellen White. Notice what she says, and you probably are familiar with this paragraph, but it really, for me, creates the vision of what men's ministry is to be about. She says this: the greatest want of the world is the want of men. Men who will not be bought or sold, men who will in their inmost souls are true and honest, men who do not fear to call sin by its right name, men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole, men who will stand for the right, though the heavens fall. So I want you to imagine for a moment what it would be like if every church, every group, every company in the Texas conference were filled with men like this. What would it be like if your local church were full of men who were like this? I would say that it would literally be church changing. It would be kingdom changing if we had churches full of men who are like this. What I want to share with you is that this is what I want to do in the Texas Conference. I want each of our churches, each of our groups, each of our companies to be filled with men who fulfill this vision. Because I realize that if we have men who are like this in our local churches, it is a game changer. So what we're going to talk about is this is the vision. This is where we want to go when it comes to men's ministry in the Texas Conference. We want our churches, our companies, our mission groups to be full of men who fall into this description that Ellen White describes here in Education, page 57. How awesome that would be. But let me share with you the reality. How do we get men involved in the local church? That's the challenge. One study that I read, and it's not necessarily just Adventist, it is Christianity across the board. But one study that I read says that on any given weekend, that there are 61% women in the church compared to 39% of men in the pews in the local church. So if you were to look out at a church on a weekend, the study says that 61% of the people who attended would be women, 39% would be men. What I find very interesting is that my experience, having traveled around the Texas Conference and attended many, many churches, while the percentages may be a little bit different, I have found that this is very much the case. That many times women outnumber men in the pews in the local church on a Sabbath morning. One of the things that I discovered in my ministry is that there are many churches where women come to church by themselves, or women come with the kids by themselves, and the husbands aren't there. The women are members of the church, but their husbands aren't. The wives want their husbands to be there, but for whatever reason, and we'll talk about some of them here in a second, for whatever reason, the men don't want to come to church. So how do we get men in the local church involved in the local church when we're dealing with such a small percentage of men in the local church to begin with? Now, this isn't a study. This is just an observation that I made. Even when men attend the church, their involvement outside the Sabbath morning hours is less than women. In other words, men, if they come to church, they'll come from 9:30 to noon or 12:30 or whenever church is over. But Getting them to come to events outside of Sabbath morning is a little more difficult. To prayer meeting, to AY, to small groups, to whatever. Many times women are even more involved outside of the Sabbath morning hours than the men are. So it makes me wonder, why are men not involved in the local church? Men's involvement in the local church is often a challenge. They may feel disconnected from church activities or perceive them as uninteresting or irrelevant to their lives. There's a book, Why Men Hate to Go to Church, and it points out that many of the things we do in the church do not reach men where they are. And so the guys find it uninteresting, or, wow, that has nothing to do with where I am as a husband or a father, as a provider, or whatever it is. And so they say, why am I going to be involved in church? Overcoming this hurdle requires understanding the diverse needs and interests of men in the congregation. So we need to find out, how can we get men involved in the local church? So we've had the vision. We want churches full of men who are true to duty as the needle is to the pole. That's what we want. But the reality, the sad reality of our churches is that many of our men are not engaged in the local church. And even if they are engaged, they're barely engaged. Now, that's not true all the time. We have some very dedicated deacons. We have some very dedicated elders. We have some very dedicated other leaders who are men. That's true. But across the churches, and even in the churches, the percentage of men that could be involved is small. So what do we do? How do we get from the challenge to the vision? And that's what we want to talk about today. Let's talk about, how do we develop a strategy? What are we going to do? Now, I'm going to give you a piece of knowledge and of wisdom that, if you forget everything else I say, please, please, please remember what I'm about to say. And here's what it is. It only takes 2 men to have a men's ministry in the local church. Did you get that? It only takes 2 men to have a men's ministry in the local church. You may be here saying, man, Tom, I want to have men's ministry in my local church. You know what I would share with you? Find one other guy and you got it going. Now, I will admit, we as guys sometimes are intimidated because we see in a lot of our churches that women's ministry is very vibrant, is very exciting. Women will come to the events that the women's ministry department of the church put on. They'll come, but we as guys go, I don't know if we'll be able to do that. See, we're not trying to compete with women's ministry. We need to develop a strategy for the guys in our church. And here's what I would say to you. Remember, it only takes 2 men to have a men's ministry in your local church. Not 5, not 10, not 30, 2. And once you have those 2, then you have a men's ministry. And you can begin to develop a strategy. So what's the strategy look like? Very simple. I'm going to use the illustration of a funnel. You've all seen funnels, I'm sure. Wide at the top, much more narrow at the bottom. And so this men's ministry funnel has 2 parts to it. The wide part at the top, and then the narrow part down at the bottom that I labeled deep. So wide at the top, deep and narrow at the bottom. So at the top of the funnel, We want to reach as many men as possible in the local church and community through various events and opportunities that foster fellowship, growth, and outreach. What does it say? Reach as many men as possible. Come one, come all. But here's what I want to point out, that you need to reach men in the local church, but you also want to reach men in your community. Don't make it just about, okay, this is men's ministry for the blank SDA church. This is the men's ministry for this community that we are having at our church, that we are leading at our local church, but it's for the community. So think beyond just the men in your church. Think about men in your community, your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends. You want to reach as many men as possible through events and opportunities that foster fellowship, growth, and outreach. So that's the wide part of the strategy, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But let me introduce you to the deep, the much more narrow part. And that's where we help men grow deeper in their relationship with God, their families, and their communities. We develop men as spiritual leaders. So we can get as many men as possible into this wide part of the funnel, but the reality is, as the funnel gets more narrow, less and less men are going to participate. So we want to have a strategy that reaches as many men as possible, but also have a strategy for those men who want to grow deeper in their relationship with God, their family, and their community. So it's really a two-pronged strategy. Wide to deep. So there you go, wide. Reach as many men as possible. Come one, come all. And having events and opportunities for guys to come and be a part of it. And when you plan these events, when you plan these opportunities, they need to have two of the three attributes I'm about to share with you. So when you're planning an event, let's say men's ministry or men's prayer breakfast, or let's even say men's breakfast. Let's not even call it a prayer breakfast. Let's call it a men's breakfast. It needs to fulfill two, if not all three. Ideally, all three of these attributes are fulfilled in that event, but at least two should be. Fellowship, opportunities that foster meaningful connections and camaraderie among men through shared experiences and activities. That's a fancy way to say guys coming together and getting to know each other. Spending time together, chatting with each other, talking sports, talk hunting, talking whatever it is, but getting together and having conversation with each other. That's fellowship. Number two, growth. Events are programs aimed at nurturing spiritual, intellectual, and personal development, enabling men to grow in their faith and understanding. We just don't want an event that just is fellowship. We want an event that can be about growth. Maybe it's a presentation. Maybe it's a video. Maybe it's a discussion on how a guy can grow to be a better husband, a better father, a better employee, a better man. That they can walk out of them and say, okay, I now have some tools where I can grow. And then the third attribute is outreach. Activities that engage men in service and evangelism, extending their influence beyond church walls to positively impact their community. So this men's breakfast can be evangelistic because you want it to reach beyond the walls. You just don't want it for the guys of your local church. You want it for other people as well. I'll give you an example. I was invited to a men's breakfast at a local church here about a year ago. And there were about 30 to 40 guys there, and it was amazing to just see the fellowship that was happening. Guys laughing and talking and enjoying time together. That fulfilled the fellowship attribute. But it just wasn't about the talking, the laughing, the getting to know each other. I also was asked, part of the reason I was there was because I was asked to share with the guys a short talk, a short presentation on what it means to be a man. What does a man look like in Scripture? And so the guys could walk out of there with the understanding, okay, now I know here are some things that I can implement in my life. And so that breakfast checked the box of fellowship. That breakfast checked the box of growth. But what I loved was when I walked around the room chatting with the different tables, I ran into a number of guys who would say, Pastor Tom, here, I want you to meet Joe. He's my neighbor. This is his first time here. And so, Tom, I want you to just meet him and thanks for what you share. Joe may not come to other activities the church has, but because the planners of this breakfast said we want it to be a safe place for men to invite their non-church going or their non-Adventist friends, then it checks the box of outreach too. So any event you have that is to reach any and all men in your community or in your church needs to fulfill at least two of these attributes: fellowship, growth, and outreach. So what are some examples? Small groups. Now this is kind of an umbrella. A small group is any group that comes together for a purpose. So what are some small groups? We have Bible studies. This is one of the ones we're probably the most familiar with. Coming together for a Bible study through a book of the Bible, or dealing with men's issues. Maybe addiction to pornography, or how to be a better husband, or how to be a better father, how to be a better employer or employee. An issue that men are doing. What does it mean for a man who is hitting midlife? How do you process through that? How do you navigate through that? So that small group can be focused on either Bible study or men's issues. But that's not the only kind of small groups you can have. You can have activity groups. This is where guys come together and do something. I know of a church that has a group where guys come together to do stained glass together, where another group that plays basketball once a week. I had a small group that I met with every Tuesday and Thursday, and I played racquetball with them. Now, it wasn't something that the church said, oh, Tom, this is your small group. No, it just was a small group. There was about 6 or 7 of us that would get together and we would play racquetball. But you know what happens when you play racquetball? You also get a chance to talk. And what was cool about this group was that it was not just guys that I knew from the church. It was also some guys that we got to know outside the church that were part of the same gym that we went to. And we got to invest in each other's lives. So a small group doesn't necessarily just need to mean a Bible study group. Those are important, but it also can be an activity group, a group of guys coming together to do something that they share an interest with. Another group I knew of, they love to ride bikes. They would get up at dark 30 on Sunday mornings and they will go out and ride bikes. That's a small group. And then group projects. Get a group of guys together and go do something at the church. But I would say go do something somewhere outside the church. One of our small churches has a men's ministry, and they love to go into the community and find houses where those who are senior citizens may not be able to cut the lawn or may not be able to paint the outside of their house or repair, their railings or whatever it may be. But the men's ministry of that church go and they do that. And so they're doing it for someone else, but they're also spending time together in fellowship. And the neat thing with that is that it's just not men's ministry in that local church. There's guys outside of the church that are a part of that. So those are small groups: Bible studies, men issues, activity groups, group projects. Here's another one, and I mentioned it before: men's breakfast. Casual gatherings over a meal, fostering fellowship and camaraderie. Again, make sure it checks 2 of the 3 boxes: growth, fellowship, and outreach. This is one I think can very easily check the boxes for all 3. You can have fellowship because you're eating food, you're coming together to break bread, but you're also having a speaker come in or a discussion about how to grow as men. But then you open it up to where men can feel very comfortable inviting their neighbors, their coworkers, their friends. Athletic opportunities. Organized sports teams. I love the experience that I had when I was at Arlington. One of the guys who was one of the men's ministry leaders decided that he and some other guys would go and create and field a team in the Arlington City Softball League. And they would play softball every Sunday. Now, what was interesting was they called themselves the Haystacks. Well, that was interesting because it created conversation, because other teams would want to know, why in the world was this team called what does a bunch of straw have to do with anything? And so they got a chance to have a conversation about the Adventist unique culinary delight called Haystacks. But more importantly, that group was known, that team, the Haystacks, was known for, at the end of every game, win or lose, win big, win close, lose close, they would pray with the other team. And they became known as the team that prays with everybody. It was interesting. I played a couple seasons with them and had a blast, but it was so cool to see this athletic opportunity that grew the men in the church and some other guys that were invited to be a part of the group, but also the impact that it had on some of these other teams. And then church-wide men's weekends or retreats, having a men's weekend. And again, it doesn't have to be anything huge, doesn't have to be anything elaborate. It can just be a bunch of guys going somewhere for a weekend, or even just going to the church and meeting at the church in another room and just spending time connecting with each other, learning from and with each other, and growing spiritually, praying with each other. But these are events that are part of the wide strategy. Anybody can come. Any man in the church, any man in the community can feel comfortable coming to these events. So let's shift to the more narrow part of the men's ministry funnel, and that's the deep. This is, again, not every man is going to be a part of that. You'll have some guys that will stay at the top of the funnel. We want them to come down, but not everyone will. So this strategy helps men grow deeper in their relationship with God, their families, and their communities. In other words, we are developing men as spiritual leaders. So when we talk about deep, when we talk about this narrow, I want to talk about some assumptions. Number one is that every man is called to lead. Every man has a responsibility to guide and influence those around him in his home, in his workplace, in his community, his church. Men are called to lead. And so we want to help men lead well. Leadership is cultivated over time. Developing leadership skills and developing as a spiritual leader is a gradual process. It does not happen overnight. It does not happen just in a weekend. It requires consistent effort and consistent intentionality. by having guys pour into them, but also having guys around them that they can bounce ideas off of and grow together. And number three, leadership is not a one-time event. You can't come for a weekend and say, okay, I'm now a leader. It is a lifelong journey of growth, learning, and practice. And so it takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort. By recognizing the call for men to lead and embracing the need for long-term community-based leadership development, we can empower men to become the spiritual pillars they're meant to be, to help them become what Ellen White is talking about there in education, page 57. So how do we do it? Let me give you the best way to do it is through curriculums. I'm of the great opinion you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So if there's some leadership curriculums out there already, use them. So here's some examples of some leadership curriculum. Number one is Joshua's Men. It's a curriculum that I wrote and developed based upon another spiritual leadership curriculum. It's from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective. And guys meet once a month in a small group where they read books on various topics, where they come together to pray for each other and with each other, where they do life together and develop as spiritual leaders. I've seen this effective in the local church at Arlington, where I pastored. I've seen it work in other churches in the Texas Conference, and I've also seen it work in churches throughout the North American Division. And so Joshua's Men is a great resource for you to develop men as spiritual leaders in your church. And if you want to talk more about that, we can in the Q&A. Another one is 33 the series by Robert Lewis, another fantastic spiritual leadership curriculum that will develop men as spiritual leaders. It's based upon Robert Lewis's men's fraternity. It's kind of a more focused curriculum, but it is top-notch when it comes to developing men as spiritual leaders. 33 the series. And then another one is Every Man a Warrior. You can see it's a three-part series. But it, again, is a curriculum that can be used to develop men as spiritual leaders. That's not all of them, but these are the ones that I have found helpful and that I have had recommended to me as very good curriculum to help men grow as spiritual leaders. So here's the question. We've got the vision. Man is true to duty as needle of the pole. That's the vision. We want our churches full of that. We've got our strategy. We've got the wide part, come one, come all, and events that fulfill that, but also then our deep strategy, how to develop men as spiritual leaders. But now the question has to be, how in the world do I implement that strategy? So let's talk about that. Remember what I said before. All it takes is 2 guys to have a men's ministry. Don't think that to have a men's ministry, you have to have a critical mass of 10 guys. All you need is 2. And you've got yourself a men's ministry. If your church doesn't have a men's ministry leader, talk to your pastor to begin that process. Men's ministry leader is elected by the church. It is nominated by the nominating committee or the church board, and it is elected by the local church. You may be the men's ministry leader in your local church. You may have a burden and be feeling the leading of God. Man, maybe God is calling me to be the men's ministry leader. Talk to your pastor. Get some counsel from him how you can start men's ministries in the local church. I'm surprised how many of our churches don't have men's ministries. So if you're interested in being a men's ministry leader, or talk to your pastor, get that process started. And then once the person is elected, let's say it's you, please communicate with the conference men's ministry department, i.e. me, so that you or they can receive resources and communication. Men's ministry leaders, I have a list of men's ministry leaders in our local churches, and I communicate to them upcoming events, resources, things that will help them do their job better. Communicate that to me. If you're a men's ministry leader in your local church and you've not reached out to me, please let me know, because I want to know that you're the men's ministry leader for such and such a church, so I can communicate to you directly about the things and give you the resources that can help you. I have a welcome packet that I give to all of our men's ministry leaders with some books, with some handouts, so that you're able to grow your men's ministry in your local church. So please, once you're elected, if it's you, if it's someone else, have them communicate with me so they can receive resources and communication. Assemble a team. I cannot stress this enough. Assemble a team. Again, if it's you and one other person, you got your team. If it's a team of 5 or 6, even better. Do not be a lone ranger. Because I guarantee you, if you're a lone ranger, you will burn out. Guaranteed. So make sure that you have a team around you. One other person, at the very least, hopefully more than a few people coming around you. But don't do men's ministry yourself. You will burn out. Acquire a budget. I've ran into some men's ministry leaders say, Pastor Tom, I just fund the men's ministry from my local wallet. And I say, I appreciate the generosity, but your church needs to have some buy-in. Guys who want to support men's ministry need to be able to share that too. So acquire a budget. Talk to your pastor. Pastor, this is what we want to do this year. This is what we think it's going to cost. Can the church help us with this? Acquire a budget from your church to fund men's ministries activities. This is key. Create and distribute a survey to the men of the church, asking for input as to the activities they would like to see and help with. Can I broaden that a little bit? Don't just do it for the men of the church, but maybe some friends that you have. Hey, could you fill this out? I'm just interested in getting some guys' perspectives as to what events you'd be interested in. Now, I'm all about not reinventing the wheel. So if you go to our website, TexasAdventistMen.org, and click on resources, there are 2 surveys there that have been used. Download them, tweak them however you want, but they have been used in local churches to survey the men of the church to find out what they want. One of the things I learned very quickly was, don't think you as a men's ministry leader know what the men of the church want. Don't shoot in the dark. Ask the guys, hey, what are some things you would like to do? What are some small groups you'd like to do? What are some activities? Find out. Because that will help you guide and direct your men's ministry so that it's scratching where the guys itch when it comes to needs and interests. But you can find some at TexasAdventistMen.org/resources. Next, start small. Don't do everything at one time. It is better to do a few things well than several things with mediocrity. Don't try to do a men's breakfast, a men's weekend, 10 small groups, an outreach project if you're just starting out. Start small. It's better to do these few things well, maybe a men's prayer breakfast and a couple of small groups and maybe a leadership group, than trying to do 6 things at one time and they all end up not being done well. Start small. And remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither will your men's ministry. Don't do everything at one time. Start small. Have activities when you're looking at that. Have activities which fulfill wide and or deep strategy. It might be helpful to have one of each to begin. So if you're beginning, think about, okay, what is one event we can have that fulfills the wide strategy? So maybe you say, hey, we're going to do a men's breakfast. Okay, do that men's breakfast once a month or once a quarter. But also have maybe start a Joshua's Men group, or start a group of guys going through 33, or going through Every Man a Warrior, that fulfills that deep strategy. But make sure that your events fall into one of those two categories. And my suggestion is, as you're beginning small, start out with one that fulfills the wide, one that fulfills the deep. And then at the end of the year, and I can't stress this enough, evaluate. Many times we don't evaluate what we do. What does that mean? That means we look at what we did well. How did we do? Did it work? What are some things we want to keep? What are some things we want to change? Evaluate. Figure out how you did. One of the things that I love to do is at the end of every event, have a survey that just asks, very simple, what are some things you liked? What are things you didn't like? What are some ideas? Some of the best ideas come out of those surveys. So evaluate. Don't be afraid to evaluate. Because I think sometimes we're afraid of somebody's going to say, oh, this was terrible. Well, it's better to find out that it didn't work then than try it 3 more times and it keep not working. So evaluate, evaluate, evaluate. But also, in addition to evaluation, plan. Look ahead. What can we do next year? Coming out of our evaluation, what are some things guys want to deal with? What are some of the things that guys want to do and grow in? So plan for the coming year. Make it a practice to grow the ministry every year. So maybe this year you have one wide and one deep event or group of events. Next year have 2, maybe 2 leadership groups, and 2, maybe a prayer breakfast and a men's ministry weekend. But make a practice to grow your men's ministry each and every year. All right. I'm excited about your questions, but before we get to that, I want to talk to you about 2 events that are coming up here in the Texas Conference for you as men. Number 1, November 15th through 17th, 2024, at Lakeview Camp and Retreat Center in Waxahachie, which is right here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We have Engage, our men's ministry retreat. I'm so excited. We have not had an English men's ministry event since conference-wide event since 2019, and I'm so excited. Elder Tony Noble Sr., who is a vice president at the Southwestern Union, is going to be our keynote speaker. Tony is fantastic. And I guarantee he will make you laugh. He will make you cry. He will challenge you. He will grow you. So Tony is going to be our keynote speaker. We're going to have some breakout groups, some smaller groups to discuss and learn some things. And then Hugo Yin, who led worship a couple of years ago at the last men's ministry retreat. Fantastic worship leader. He's going to do a concert for us Sabbath afternoon. So I am excited about this event coming up November 15th through 17th at Lakeview. Registration opens on June 1. There will be a cost because meals will be provided, lodging will be provided. But registration will open on June 1. Look out on TexasAdventistmen.org. That's where the link to registration will be beginning on June 1. I would love to see hundreds and hundreds of guys from our churches throughout the Texas Conference coming to this men's ministry retreat where we're looking at Engage. Another event for those of you in the Houston area that we are partnering with the men's ministry leader of the Houston West Church. That is the Purpose Driven Man Conference, July 5th and 6th. As you can see, the speakers there, Elder Carlos Craig, who is our conference or our union president. Got to get that right. Myself, Elder Stephen Brooks, who is the executive secretary for the Southwestern Union, Pastor Roderick Bishop, who is our prayer ministries leader on the English side for the Texas Conference and a local pastor, Dr. Earl Bryce, Dr. Lightbody, both are physicians. So it is going to be a phenomenal event. Again, I will give you more information on the Texas Adventist AdventistMen.org website with this. But please mark this, especially if you're in the Houston area. Even if you're not in the Houston area, head down there for Friday and Sabbath. You will be blessed by the Purpose Driven Man Conference. Last thing, contact information again. Two things I don't want you to forget. One, you and one other guy can do men's ministry. You can have a men's ministry if it's just the two of you. But number two, TexasAdventistMen.org is your place to go for all the information. It's where you'll get resources. It's where you will find the registration for the event coming up in November here in DFW for the entire conference, but also for the Purpose Driven Man Conference there in Houston in July. TexasAdventistMen.org, my office number, my email. But please take advantage. I want to be here for you to help facilitate men's ministry in your local church.